very much, Martin. As Martin mentioned, lots of the kind of early marine biology was done on the rocky shore, so I want to start with a little bit of a history lesson. I want to talk to you about Charles Darwin, Grandad Charles up there. So Charles was well renowned for developing the theory of evolution by natural selection. The things that he thought about and did have shaped the way that we look at the natural world, more so perhaps than anybody else. And when he was in his 20s, he spent some time here in Plymouth before departing on the Voyage of the Beagle to distant lands such as New Zealand, South America and the Galapagos, a group of islands off the coast of Ecuador in the Pacific. And when he was there, he collected finches and brought those back to England for those to be studied. John Gould then set about studying them. Unfortunately, Charles hadn't labelled where he'd got the birds from, which specific island he'd got them from, so it took John a while to kind of figure this out, but eventually they figured out that lots of the species came from different islands and so on. And Charles carried on thinking about these animals and the different species, and eventually he thought that these species had come from one ancestral species and diverged through time to exploit different resources. And in his notebook, he drew this evolutionary tree. Much like a family tree, we can see these lines branching off over time, becoming more and more complicated, more different, more interesting. So from this page in his notebook comes this theory that kind of shapes the way that we look at the natural world. Why am I telling you about this one? I'm supposed to be telling you about the rocky shore. Well, as I said, he spent some time here in Plymouth before he set off for 5 years away from England, 18 months of those at sea. And this is before the times of online check-in and Skype. You know, the hardships, the homesickness, the seasickness, the hunger, thirst, all these things that he must have felt must have been, you know, really powerful to him. So his last few moments in his homeland in Plymouth must have been really precious to him. Actually, he said that these 2 months in Plymouth were the most miserable which I ever spent. Thanks, Darwin. Not that it's fair, is it? Now, obviously, he was preparing for this very difficult voyage, and apparently the weather wasn't very good when he was here, and I think we can probably all let him off for that. But you know, I do think that he missed a trick, you know, that the rocky shores in and around Plymouth Sound are incredibly special places. Hopefully I can show you a little bit of that. So from now on I'll talk to you about the rocky shore, which roughly speaking is between high and low tide, where the substrate or the ground is made out of rocks. It's that simple, really. And it's important to point out that the rocky shore is quite a hard place to live. So the tide comes in and out twice a day, and all the organisms that live there have to deal with this and the changes in things like temperature, salinity, oxygen availability, any predators that might want to have their lunch, so these kind of things. So if we imagine being this snail, this flat periwinkle, if we manage to find ourselves a rock pool to spend low tide in, to stay nice and wet so we don't dry out, the temperature might still change, or the salinity might change, or the availability of oxygen might change. And even if those don't, an air raid from birds like oyster catchers might single us out and they might eat us for their lunch. Despite this, it's a really popular place to live. There's lots and lots of stuff there. Even the bits that look just like rocks are often covered in these things, a bit blurry here, but barnacles, and even the bits that just a bare rock are covered in a biofilm of living microbes that are too small to see with the naked eye. We can term all this biodiversity. There's this rich array of life. So if you think about Darwin's evolutionary tree, the evolutionary tree that relates to the rocky shore is incredibly complicated. The pressures of living on the rocky shore have forced this tree to bud off and flourish. It's incredibly complicated. If we take one small group, these snails, they're all gastropods, meaning that they crawl around on their bellies. There are at least 5 different species here. So if we take the grey one just here above the seaweed, that's a whelk. Dan likes whelks, he showed you a picture of all those pretty whelks earlier. They're predators, so they'll go along looking for things like mussels, drill holes into them and suck out their insides. Quite gruesome. Which contrasts with these periwinkles here. So on the previous slide we saw a periwinkle. They make their living by crawling along brown seaweeds, eating microbes. So one small group, but again, many branches. If we take these seaweeds, they look kind of similar, you know, you can find them on the same rocky shore, but they're as different from each other as we are from the edible crab up at the top. So similar in form, they look kind of similar at first glance, but they're very, very different, and this is this richness of this evolutionary family tree. I want to talk to you about a few of my favourites. I'll talk to you about 3 of my favourite species now. This is an anemone. We've already heard a little bit about anemones. First thing that strikes me about this snake locks anemone is the colour, this beautiful kind of purple, and green coloration. The greenness due to a symbiotic relationship with algae, much like the symbiotic relationship that goes on with coral reefs. The algae benefit from this by getting a nice home to live in, and also they can use some of the waste products from the anemone as well, which is useful to them. And also the anemone benefits because some of the energy that comes down from the sun can be used by them as well. So it's quite a nice relationship. They're often found on their own on the rocky shore, often in fairly shallow waters because they require this sunlight. And they can actually do a pretty clever trick. They can split in half and become two anemones. And that's exactly what happened on the glass of my aquarium here. You can see them breaking apart and becoming two anemones. And in species found that are closely related to those that are found in Plymouth, they can take this to the extreme and become huge clonal mats of one clone, so all genetically identical, but lots and lots of those individuals. And in possibly my favourite name for a scientific paper, Behind Anemone Lines, a bit cheesy, but it's pretty. Scientists, they get bored easily. They need to get their kicks where they can. But you can see these two different clonal groups facing off against each other, trying to vie for precious territory. So all the individuals on the right here are genetically identical, all the ones on the left here are genetically identical, and they're both fighting off in that kind of no man's land. But within these groups, all genetically identical, they can have many different body forms and show different varieties of behaviour. One example of this is scouts, so small anemones that wander off into no man's land, apparently assessing the kind of dangers of the enemy clone. Here we can see a small scout at the bottom here. He's coming in to sort of assess the other line, and above him there, another type of kind of morph, which is called a warrior. And they've got these, you can see the arrow here pointing to these stinging tentacles, which contain stinging cells much like those that you find in jellyfish. They're called acrorhagi. And he's coming down to kind of protect his line. So for animals that don't even have a brain, they're making some really, really clever sort of strategic ways of doing things on the rocky shore. Moving on, hermit crabs. Now these are my favourite of all the rocky shore sea creatures, and again they show some really amazing behaviour as well. They've devised a really good way of protecting themselves here by using these snail shells. It means that they don't have to invest lots of energy in building a nice kind of strong shell, like you would see on a shore crab, for example. And what happens when they outgrow these shells? Well, they just find a bigger shell and move into that. So it's nice and easy for them. Unfortunately, shells are in relatively short supply on the rocky shore, so they often resort to fighting over these shells. One clever way to avoid this fighting is to form chains of individuals and just wait for the next shell to become available, and then you can upgrade, and the guy behind you can move in and so on. So everybody wins. In research done here at Plymouth by Mark Briffer and Mark Austin, they found that these chains were more well organised in the presence of predators. So if they sensed that there was danger, they sort of sorted themselves out quickly because they could sense this danger. So again, an animal that has nothing like the brain capacity that we have, they're making these really clever assessments and decisions about their resources. Limpets are another interesting and important species on the rocky shore. So they're gastropods, much like the periwinkle that we looked at earlier in the whelk that we were talking about, but they've got much simpler cone-shaped shells, so without the classic torsion or twisting of a typical snail. And when they're younger, they tend to spend more of the time on the lower shore, where it's wet for more of the time, and they're well protected and they're not going to dry out. And then as they get bigger, they get bigger and stronger, and they'll move up the shore and dominate that area. Now, they've developed a really clever way to spend low tide. As I said earlier, pressures like birds coming in and trying to eat you are something that all these creatures have got to think about, and they've developed a way to sort of try and maximise their protection, with good reason. So these are oyster catchers. I'm sure some of you will have seen these or even heard them. They make a kind of crazy beeping noise as they're flying in, and they love limpets. So you can see they've got these long, strong beaks that are kind of like a cross between chopsticks and a chisel. They can use this to chip the limpets off the rocks and snip them out of their shells. But the limpets have devised a clever way to sort of make sure that they're a bit safer on the rocky shore, and they carve out these home scars. So they always return to these home scars at low tide, and it just offers them that extra bit of protection that they can lock into this home scarf. And they always return to the same one. So even if you try and confuse them by picking them up and putting them elsewhere, they still manage to find their way back. So really amazing. Again, something that's such a simple creature, something that we wouldn't really think about. They do these clever things. They're always trying to outwit us. So another great benefit of limpets is that they graze the algae that lives there. So this photograph is taken from a limpet removal experiment that was done in South Africa. And you can see in these square boxes where the limpets have not been allowed to go, the algae's gone crazy and it's grown, and it kind of stops anything else from using that area. So the limpets offer a kind of a useful way of controlling what lives on the rocky shore. If you remove them, then things change. So if we remove or add things, we can see that this kind of disrupts the balance of the rocky shore. One thing that the addition of that can cause many problems is this, Sargassum mutica, or Japanese wireweed. And this arrived in Plymouth, or was first seen in Plymouth in the 70s, and it was thought to have arrived in the country with Japanese oysters. And this lives in rock pools, or below the in the subtidal, below the lowest tide. And the problem is that it grows incredibly fast and can reproduce vegetatively. So if a small part breaks off, that can then grow and further exacerbate the problem. And one of the major concerns about this is that it seems to be taking over areas that were previously covered in seagrass beds. So we heard earlier from Dan that seagrass beds are incredibly important habitats, and these seem to be replacing it. Plastics are another kind of a problem. Now this hermit crab looks pretty happy, but these plastics can cause real problems, and especially microplastics. So pieces of plastic that are very small that are broken off from these large pieces of plastic, or plastic that's found in things like exfoliating shower gel. It can cause real problems for filter feeders and so on, and end up in the food chain, and then possibly end up back with us as well. So not good for anyone really. On a kind of larger scale, you'll all remember the storms that hit earlier this year that cut rail links to the southwest and caused millions of pounds worth of damage. These are set to become more and more extreme and more prevalent with climate change. So, that's not good for any of the habitats that we heard about this evening, and it's not good for us, and it's not good if you want to go out for a Chinese, because the Chinese restaurants are going to be washed away. Now, you can kind of feel a bit sort of bogged down by all this, climate change, invasive species, all this stuff. So I'm going to get a bit philosophical now, but when it all gets a bit much for me, I think of the 13th century poet and mystic Rumi, who said, "The universe is not outside of you. Look inside yourself. Everything that you want to be, you are already that." And I think he's right, because we already know that these things are bad. We already know that the natural world's a very beautiful and powerful thing. And there's more good news. We live a stone's throw away from the rocky shore. We can all go there. We can all go and visit these habitats and spend more of our time there. And there are some great organisations that we can go and help out and get involved with. So maybe you would want to come here, like us guys, and study marine biology and spend lots of your time on the rocky shore, rain or shine, usually rain. Perhaps you want to spend a little bit less time than that, a couple of weekends a year, a couple of weekends a month. The Wembury Marine Centre, for example, or the NBA, run regular surveys to look at invasive species. And the NBA in particular, they do things called rock pool rambles, where you can go out and get up close and personal with the creatures that I've talked to you about this evening, and more of course. Opals are another really interesting organisation, the Open Air Laboratory. You can log onto their website and you don't even have to leave your back garden. If you've got a pond, you can tell them what you find in your pond. Or you can go looking for earthworms or bats and tell them what you find and contribute to their data. Or you could go and build a hedge with Devon Wildlife Trust. Why not? Why am I telling you about building hedges when I'm trying to convince you to protect the rocky shore? Well, the thing is that all of these ecosystems are interconnected. The health of our land affects the health of our rivers. The health of our rivers affects the health of our estuaries. The health of our estuaries affects our coasts and seas and so on. It's all interconnected. And the thing is that being out in nature is good just in itself. I bet there's somewhere nearby, even if I've not convinced you to go to the rocky shore more often, I bet there's somewhere in nature that you wish you could spend more time. So why not, when you're there, do a little bit of science, contribute, kind of join in with these organisations and contribute your own small verse to the great Homeric poem of science. That's it from me. Thanks for listening.